the feeling that I got is that you're so deeply involved and passionate. You're talking as a physicist to me or a radiographer.
But the third project that I did for the hospital was an MRI. And I just became fascinated with the technology. MRI was then, is today magic to me. I was terrified that I had missed something important on that first MRI project that I did.
Some hospitals follow ACR manual. Some hospitals follow MHRA. Some hospitals don't follow anything because they never heard of those documents.
At the moment, it seems there are more questions than answers. Is that people tend to think, okay, remote scanning seems a big thing, but what about safety?
Burns, projectiles, and hearing damage. 90% of injuries in the MRI environment fall into those three categories.
One of the issues with MRI safety as well is the fact that we don't have anything that is mandatory. It's all guidance.
How can we have this modality that has these safety implications and not require the facility design actually try and address those safety implications?
Our guest was saying MRI is the safest thing ever, and I was like, actually, I keep saying MRI is not safe.
The physics doesn't change from the EU to the US to Australia to Singapore to, the physics is the physics. You do those three things and you will virtually eliminate burns in MRI. The MR radiographer historically has really had two very different sets of skills, right? They can drive the MR scanner and they can manage direct patient care.
MR safety is one of those topics that we covered the most since we started the podcast. First, by describing the tools we can use to, enhance safety, like FMDs, but also we spoke about education with credentialing, MRSO, MRSC, and I think with you we can add a little extra layer, of safety to our conversation by discussing what are the most interesting developments and also how the entire landscape of MRI safety is changing. I know you're the right person for this, Tobias, but first, a personal interest, because I don't encounter every day architects that got so involved about MRI and specifically MRI safety. So what led you to get this specific path as a background as an architect into MRI first and MRI safety after?
Pure accident. I would love to say that there was some intentional design behind this, but it was really sort of what was put in front of me. I originally went to architecture school to get my master's in architecture because I had worked in theaters and I had been working in these buildings that I felt were designed by people who didn't understand the work that was done inside them. And had they better understood the work that was done inside, they would have done this differently or that differently. And so I originally went to architecture school with the intent of becoming a theater designer because I had been inside these buildings. I knew the ways in which they needed to work. We just needed somebody to design them that way. Mm-hmm. And after I got to architecture school, I actually looked up, how many architecture firms in the United States design live theaters. This was the late 90s. And at the time, there were two architecture firms in the entire country.
Wow.
That
for a country like US, it's like
300 million people.
And so I decided that's probably not a really wise career move. I wasn't super excited about going to either of the two places where those firms were located. So I essentially threw up my hands and I was like, well, I'll be a regular architect, whatever that means. Completed my master's program, went to work for a small firm, and the small firm had done, prior to me arriving, they had done no healthcare. They had been asking the local county hospital to be able to do some projects for the hospital. The hospital was always doing things. And they had never received an opportunity. Coincidentally, right at the time that I got there, the man who was the director of design and construction for the county hospital, I guess they had asked 1,000,000 times, and it was the 1,000,001 time that he was like, fine, all right, I'll give you a project. And they said, well, all of our regular architects are assigned to other projects. Who can, well, we have this new kid, right? Because I was brand new.
The rookie.
It's all about timing.
I wasn't assigned to any of the existing projects. And so they essentially gave me to the hospital and said, whatever you want him to do, he will do for you. And so I did a couple of small, inconsequential projects. But the third project that I did for the hospital was an MRI. And I just became fascinated with the technology. MRI was then, is today, magic to me. Now, this was in the late 90s. So this was really before safety became a focus.
Yeah.
So then we fast forward 5 years. I'm doing another project for the same hospital. They're adding 5 years before, they had gone from 1 MRI to 2, and now they were going from 2 to 3. And I'm designing the third MRI suite. And this is in 2002, right when the original ACR white paper on MR safety got published. And the head radiographer handed it to me and says, I can't make heads or tails of this. Whatever it says to do, please do this for us. And I read through it, and after initially not really understanding what it was describing, and once I kind of got a picture of this, I had a panic attack moment because I was like, I didn't do any of these things
on the previous
one. And in between the first one and the second one, I had done CT projects and nuclear medicine projects for the same hospital, and was acutely aware of how much design standards or codes there were for ionizing radiation. And I was terrified that I had missed something important on that first MRI project that I did, because I was less than 6 months out of university. I barely knew what I was doing.
And you didn't have a guideline to do it or something like that?
The vendor of the MR system essentially, slides you their book, on how to cite their product, and that's
you had to learn on the way, essentially.
Exactly. But I was terrified because I couldn't remember any conversations about safety with that first project, and so I dug back into it and looked at the state regulations and licensure requirements and all of this stuff, and there were no rules whatsoever.
Wow.
And then my panic that I had missed something turned into anger or frustration that there was nothing to be missed, right? That how can we have this modality that has these safety implications and not require the facility design actually try and address those safety implications? And so that was the summer of 2002 when I was designing the hospital's third MRI. And that really sort of launched my interest into MRI safety. It started out initially with just sort of the physical environment and doors and windows and walls and line of sight and zones. But it quickly grew to include everything. Everything MRI, or everything MRI safety.
Well, thank you for the mention.
That's awesome. So can I ask you this question that I think everyone asks? So is MRI safe or not? Because from my perspective, and I know there's been a little bit of a debate, and even we were recording another podcast before this one, and this question came about as well. Because our guest was saying MRI is the safest thing ever, and I was like, actually, I keep saying MRI is not safe.
And I was neutral. Yeah, I didn't want to say anything.
And
I
people
was staying in the middle.
normally go like, why you say it's not safe? So I want your opinion on it, and if you can substantiate your opinion with some facts, if possible. It's not black and white, of course.
It's not black and white, and I think one of the challenges in having a conversation exactly on the question that you're asking is we have to first try and really identify what's the nature of the risk, right? So everybody always wants to draw comparisons between MRI and CT, right? So let's compare CT with CT, right? In the CT environment, the only time that we have a safety concern is when we're actively imaging a patient, right? The physical environment, there's nothing peculiar to it.
It's innocuous,
Yeah. So we have an instantaneous risk. episodic instantaneous risk that occurs in CT. In MR, we have a persistent risk. It's more closely similar to like a hot lab, right? Where we have radioisotopes and we have potential nuclear, material exposure, right? So on that level, the direct comparison between CT and MR really starts to break down, right? On another level, if we look at what's the nature of injury, right? In CT, if many accreditation organizations essentially say if for any ionizing radiation study, if you overdose or underdose by a factor of greater than 20% of what the intended dose was, right? That's a mistake that needs to be sort of documented.
Yeah, reportable incident, yeah.
All right. Let's take an extreme event. Let's say a patient was overdosed with ionizing radiation by 50%, right? Instead of 6 units of ionizing radiation, they got 9 or 10, units of ionizing radiation. What does that mean in terms of harm to the patient? We have no idea.
Yeah, it's subjective at this point, yeah, absolutely.
We don't know whether this patient actually will have been injured by either the base dose or by the fact that they got an excessive dose, right? The odds are extraordinarily good that their body will repair all of the damage, and 2 weeks after their exam, it will be as if it never happened, right? But we just don't know. We have to look at stochastic risk probabilities, and we say, well, that individual has a 1 in 46,000 chance that they will, at some point later in their life, develop a cancer.
But we can't pinpoint to that exact exam they had.
No,
that's the issue.
Yeah, we can't trace it back. All we can really do is look at a group of people who got a lot of X-rays, ionizing radiation exposure, versus a group of people who got almost none, right? And essentially compare lifetime outcomes for those various groups. We have no way of being able to say, this exam produced this result in this patient at this time, right? So it's extraordinarily difficult to be able to trace back. And I would also argue that when we're looking at not only risk, but the potential of harm, the immediacy of the harm is really something that we should take into account. Nobody wants to face the risk of developing a cancer, whether it's tomorrow or 20 years from now, right?
Absolutely.
So I'm not trying to discount the fact that somebody does develop a cancer 20 years later. But if we want to look at an injury's impact on somebody's ability to live their life to the fullest, right? If I bring an oxygen cylinder into an MRI room and it goes flying and it shatters your arm, right? You survive, but you are going to suffer lifelong consequences from that from the day of the event. Whereas in an overdose type of situation, you may or may not experience the negative consequences 20, 30, 40 years down the road. So I think our tendency is to try and distill these very profound differences, down into some equation, right? Ionizing radiation bad, unsafe. MRI, no ionizing radiation, therefore safe. But I think that distillation really misses a lot of the differences between those two environments, those two exposures. One other thing is the brief nature of the risk in an X-ray CT environment. It makes it such that when we're looking at MRI, right, and the MRI environment and managing that risk by comparison, we only have to actively manage risk for this moment, when we're actually capturing the image in X-ray, CT, MR, fluoro,
in a few seconds.
Right? Otherwise, we get to completely relax and pay no attention to it. On the MRI side, it's 24/7, 365 vigilance.
And one more thing, the CT is heavily regulated.
Exactly.
In terms of radiation dose they can give.
Absolutely. So there are all kinds of structures in place, right? Ionizing radiation, you have to have a radiation safety officer. Otherwise, you don't even get your X-ray, right?
Yeah.
On the MRI side, the radiographer will handle it, right? On the CT side, I want to go grab a cup of tea. Great, go grab a cup of tea. You have not changed the risk environment for anybody in and around.
True.
Radiographer, I want to go grab a cup of tea.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry, you can't do that, right?
And if you have an incident on CT, you have to, by law, report it straight away to whoever is regulating the ionizing radiation.
Yeah.
Right.
If you have an incident on MR, most of the people don't have even where to go to report it.
Exactly.
And that's a point I'll touch later because you're doing amazing work on that. But there's another thing that adds to your point.
I think what he said, I would say, perfectly answered your question. I think it's a much more complex way of describing rather than, a yes or no answer in this sense. And I want to ask you, Tobias, because your career is extensive and you must have, seen a lot of safety accidents or whatever. Is there any safety concern, I would say safety risk, that you think this is something definitely requires more attention than anything else? Like if you need to list like a top 3, just guessing of like safety concerns that you will say, oh, this have a certain priority. Is that something that would be feasible to do in your opinion?
Yeah, with the caveat that next week I'll probably have a different top 3 list. So I think, tying back to one of the things we just talked about, I think one of the great challenges with MRI and MRI safety is governance and structures. And I think far too few MRI providers, whether they're hospitals or imaging centers, I think far too few providers actually have governance structures in place, effective governance structures. So I would love to see every MRI provider essentially looking at an MRSO, an MRMD, and whoever provides their physics services, through them an MRSE role. I think by assigning those individuals, then all of the minutia of managing the individual different risks, we begin to impose a structure, a formalism to who's responsible and who takes charge of these things. I think in the absence of these sort of structural solutions, I think that we're putting out individual fires, right? Yeah. Which isn't to say that there aren't individual fires that need attention. Probably number 2 on my list would be the proliferation of implants and devices.
Very true.
And that I not only do I not see this slowing down in the future, I see this accelerating further.
Absolutely.
And so whatever challenges an individual site has today,
it's going to double
tomorrow,
or triple.
next year, you're going to have more.
Do you
of
think
this.
that maybe, since they will be hopefully better documented, with the device card and whatever, this will be less of an issue, or the proliferation will be as such that we'll still need to be a little bit more careful on this side?
Well, I live and work primarily in the United States. And in the U.S., the U.S. Food and Drug Administration is actually doing a much better job today compelling implant and device manufacturers to provide MRI safety information, which I think is brilliant. But while that is improving the situation, we also have greater transience of people across the world. Me here with you guys in London, right?
Of course.
And vice versa. And so what we're seeing is people from all different countries and all different experiences in terms of their medical access, traveling all across the world. So while the U.S. and them improving labeling of U.S. products and devices is a very good thing, it by no means solves the problem, right? And, and I recognize that there are many other countries that are doing similarly in terms of promoting labeling of implants and devices. So that's working in our favor. But even if we could wave a wand and tomorrow every product would have some sort of labeling, differences in the way that the individual companies go about labeling their products. There's some products out there that it's like, why did you even bother putting this on the label? This is so pointless. This is so confusing or convoluted that even though the labeling exists, it doesn't really help in describing patient care. Or the company takes such an extraordinarily conservative approach that they label something, because some government entity requires that they have MR labeling, but they do it in such a way that it is so restrictive or it precludes...
Just to protect themselves, basically.
Just to protect themselves, right. To take the... MHRA, US FDA, you tell me I have to have some labeling, associated with MRI, so I'm going to label this at 1.5 only, and because I have an irrational fear of what this device may
and
heat.
Because MRI is not their market, they're not their clients. They're selling to surgeons, they're selling to hospitals. So
Exactly.
They don't really care about what we need or not.
So you'll get an implant or device that may be labeled at 1.5 only, and 0.5 watts per kilo, and a slew rate of 100 Tesla per meter per second, and it may be a passive device that's 4 centimeters long, and really there's virtually no opportunity for it to heat. So why are we requiring such restrictive, RF values? And it's made of nitinol, so why are we limiting it to 1.5 instead of, allowing it to 3? And because so many of these implant and device manufacturers don't understand what the questions are and how the answers to those questions influence patient care at the point of care, all they're trying to do is
tick a box.
Exactly. Yeah, they're trying to conform to some regulatory requirement to do this thing so that we can market our product. And once they've done it, they're like...
Yeah. One of the things that I notice is, I don't know if you notice this when you search implants. When we go to, let's say, a Medtronic or Boston Scientific or any of those manufacturers of implants, you go on their website and they ask you, which country are you based on? And then they will give you some information that is different if you say in Portugal, in US, or in Italy, or whatever. So why is that, and where does that come from? I don't know if you can elucidate us on it, but it makes me think that safety is not standardized at all.
I can understand there is something happening behind it. Hopefully we can disclose it.
It is weird, no? It should be the same everywhere, but you have to choose the country in order to get the right information.
Yeah. So I don't think I'm revealing any great secrets by saying, in the United States, people can get very lawsuit happy, very litigious. So if we have a Medtronic USA and we have a Medtronic UK and we have a Medtronic Germany or Portugal or Italy, each one of those companies is essentially going to look at the legal environment that they operate within, right? And so if we have the exact same product that we're trying to market in each one of these countries, perhaps a Medtronic in the EU may look at this and say, you know what, we feel fairly comfortable with the development of legal and liability requirements or standards across the EU. And so we can be more generous, more permissive in terms of the information we put on the label, because even if, God forbid, something should go badly, our company has some measure of protection legally. Now, same company offering the same product in the United States, where people may be more inclined to, file lawsuits, they may say, you know what, we recognize that it's the exact same product that we're selling over in the EU market. But
it's going to be used the exact same way.
Right. But because we have a heightened level of concern about legal liability, we're going to put more conservative conditions on this, and we're essentially going to narrow the range of on-label uses of it. It has nothing ultimately to do with a determination of risk to the patient. A lot of this can be driven by risk to the company. So I see on a regular basis where, on the Facebook MRI safety group page, where we have people from all around the world, and somebody will say, I have this patient who has this implant. I wasn't able to find the labeling approved for my country. I was able to find the labeling approved in a different country. I'm being told that this is off-label, that that we're not allowed to scan this, and it makes me so frustrated because it's because MRI safety is transnational, right?
It's a common language around the world, so
it all ties back to the physics of MRI safety. And the physics doesn't change from the EU to the US to Australia to Singapore. The physics is the physics. And if we can identify a set of conditions that are safe, we need to understand that in the context of MRI, there are no absolutes, right? So if the preponderance of the information suggests that this is safe, then I call it safe, with the knowledge and understanding that there will always be sort of the outlier conditions that maybe open the door for opportunities for harm. Anybody who wants absolutes really has no business being an MRI.
Exactly.
But if you're willing to accept, 99.8%, as fundamentally everything, and you're comfortable with that, then you can work and operate effectively in sort of the MRI world.
Thank you. Perfect. I just want to ask a question as a humble radiographer. That when I see you, I always think, okay, if there are any new guidelines in terms of practice for safety, Tobias is going to tell me. I will check it out, his LinkedIn. Tobias and many other important people. So I just would like to ask you, are there any updates in terms of guidelines? Just apologies, I might not be particularly aware of any specific updates. Is there something crucial that you think this has been changed in recent years that I think you would like to share?
Well, I think that the 2024 ACR manual on MR safety is, for the most part, an absolute brilliant publication. There aren't very many new things in the 2024 in terms of, thou shalt do this. I mean, the 2024 document and all of its prior versions were really, really good, very comprehensive. But what I think is particularly good about the 2024 document is really found mostly in a bunch of the new appendices. And it's things like identifying policy and procedure considerations, right? Sort of an itemized list of, hey, have you really thought of how you're going to handle large patients and handling large patients and getting them onto a table if you don't have undockable tables, and obviously we can't bring patient lifts into the MRI room, and that's just one example of dozens and dozens of considerations for policies and procedures. The new 2024 manual also comes out with essentially sort of itemized lists of training and competency requirements or content recommendations for level 1 and level 2 MRI safety training. So the 2024 document really takes the intent of the prior documents and gives almost sort of a step-by-step, hey, if you're implementing an MRI safety training program for your hospital staff and you don't really know how to evaluate, what information ought to be in there or not, here's a recommendation. Here's essentially a curriculum of the information that should be conveyed to the level 1s, and here's what should be conveyed to the level 2s. And oh, by the way, you may not be happy at your site with just small and large, right? You may want small, medium, and large, or small, large, and extra. You may want more than just level 1 and level 2. And they also go on to explain, hey, you may want to add curriculum content items that we don't have in this list. And while we're showing it to you as small and large, you can make as many versions of this as you want to, that sort of meet your needs. And so that kind of explicit, information that helps you understand the content that goes into level 1 and level 2, and granting permission to facilities and sites to essentially say, this might not fully meet your needs. And if it doesn't, you're more than free to adapt this, expand upon this.
It's quite flexible.
Yeah.
Now, I have 2 questions about the document for you now. So one of them is, the document is guidance, right? And I think one of the issues with MRI safety as well is the fact that we don't have anything that is mandatory. It's all guidance. And I'll give you the Portuguese example. I've moved to Portugal 2 months ago, and I start talking with people in the hospitals, seeing what they're doing in terms of safety. And it was crazy to see that some hospitals follow ACR manual, some hospitals follow MHRA, some hospitals don't follow anything because they never heard of those documents. And it's like nothing is mandatory anywhere. There's all of these recommendations throwing up and about, and because the document in US is, as you said, a very comprehensive document and has all the steps. The MHRA document also very good. They most of the times kind of work in tandem.
Yeah.
But the fact that we don't have a mandatory document makes, in my perspective, think that hospitals don't know what they're doing. They just, I'm going to follow these guys because those are the ones I heard about first. I'm going to follow those guys because I have a friend that actually we're doing something with them. And I think it's kind of this environment that we're living in. And I want to hear from you what you think about if that actually affects the MRI safety environment that we have nowadays. That was my first question. I went too long. The second one is, and then probably a segue to our next topic, which is remote scanning. What do you think about the document in terms of approach to the remote scanning technology that is coming? So those are the questions that I would like to touch upon.
We might also want to mention what is remote scanning, because we always assume that people knows, but
So yes, first off, I second your perception of everybody follows whatever has sort of been set in front of them that they choose to pick up, because the MHRA document, the ACR documents are online. They're available for anybody who wants to actually seek them out. And I would agree that fundamentally the differences between the MHRA document and the ACR document, the differences are differences of vocabulary.
Yeah, absolutely.
And once you sort of reconcile the slightly different terminology, particularly in my area, when we start defining the MRI environment, once you get outside of that, there are really no discrepancies between them at all. The ACR document is more expansive. It covers more content area than the MHRA document, which I think is helpful, just as we were speaking about, policies, procedures, and training content and those sorts of things, which I think is great. But fundamentally, in terms of, sort of standards at a hospital, at an imaging center, if somebody followed the MHRA document, I think that they're likely to be in decent setup situation for that. What was the second part of your question?
No, the first part was the difference between having a guideline and not a mandatory document, because everyone follows whatever they feel like following. And the second one is the content about remote scanning. So definition of remote scanning overall for our guests, for our listeners to understand what it is and what it says on the document. Yeah.
Sort of back to the second half of the first part. With respect to requirements, in the States, things are very convoluted in terms of requirements. So if you just look for sort of direct, you are required to do this or follow this particular document, you won't find that anywhere in the States. There are, if you're willing to jump through some hoops. So, for example, in the States, if you're ACR accredited, well, actually, this is internationally. If your MR site is ACR accredited, there is actually a requirement in the accreditation terms to follow the criteria of the manual on MR safety. So if you are ACR MR accredited, you are required to follow the ACR manual. The problem is that requirement isn't a requirement of the hospital. It's a requirement of the physician, usually a radiologist, who signs the accreditation paperwork. Now, is that physician actually in a position to tell the hospital to, improve their 4 zones or deploy ferromagnetic detection or change the training regimen for their staff or any? Likely, they may be able to influence those things, but they don't have sort of direct control over those elements of safety. And then the ACR, in that section where they say you're required to follow this, they immediately follow up with a statement that says, oh, by the way, we won't check.
There you go.
We reserve the right to throw you under the bus if, God forbid, something goes badly. And we find that the reason that something went badly was you didn't follow
procedure.
So it's not preventative, it's punitive, in nature, which I think is the wrong approach. Also in the United States, almost every hospital-based MRI provider participates in federal insurance programs, Medicare, Medicaid in the U.S. In the United States, in order to participate in these programs, you have to follow what are called the conditions of participation. And in the conditions of participation for radiology services, it says you must meet professionally approved standards for safety. That's in the enabling legislation. And so I have been going around and around with the National Insurance Organization in the States saying, okay, you say that hospitals must meet this standard. Which professionally approved standards? Yeah. Because they must meet it, right? Somebody has to tell us which standards, right? And the federal agency essentially says, we don't define that. The individual states are the enforcers of the federal policies. It's up to the individual states to do this. And I was like, well, who guides them? And the national organization's like, we don't know.
There is a tiny bit of confusion, gray areas here and there. If it is like this in the States, it makes sense that even for us will be a little bit more complicated.
So the surprising and disconcerting answer to your question is things are written in such a way that it implies that there are standards. Yeah. But when you get down to the practical implementation of it, either there are no standards or there are standards that are written or applied in such a way that it's, this won't be preventative. It will be punitive if something bad happens, but we're not actually interested in taking preventative measures, which frustrates me to no end. Because if we look at how people are injured in the MRI environment, right? Burns, projectiles, and hearing damage. 90% of injuries in the MRI environment fall into those 3 categories. Well, MRI classified. They're implant and device interactions, which are very difficult to quantify. But if we take the 3 that are easy to quantify, burns, projectiles, hearing damage, we know how burns occur. There are 3 preventions: patting the patient from the transmitting RF element, patting the patient from their own tissues, separating, so we don't get large caliber body loops, using MR conditional conductive materials if we absolutely need them. So ECG, patches and leads and pulse oximetry, use the MR conditional versions of those and remove everything that's not MR conditional. You do those 3 things and you will virtually eliminate burns in MRI. This is not rocket science. This is not difficult.
And the same goes with the other two. They're almost 100% avoidable.
Exactly.
That's the point.
Yeah. Projectile accidents, if we actually have access controls, the zones, or,
FMDs, all of those things.
we deploy ferromagnetic detection, and we require labeling for things that are projectile risks inside the controlled access environment. We do those three things, and we could almost eliminate entirely projectile-related accidents. But nobody requires any of those three things, right? Nobody requires the actions of pad the patient from the transmitting RF element, pad the patient from skin-to-skin contact, require the use of MR conditional, monitoring devices, and remove everything else. These are the types of things, very simple, straightforward, existing best practices that nobody actually requires. And that's why I no longer have hair, although I used to.
Yeah, it is absolutely true. I can see from the time that I spent in MRI, most of the time it always came as a recommendation, a calling telling you, you know what, would be good also to use some padding. There wasn't specific requirement to say, padding is here, we need to use it for us, each specific patient. And then we learned this from seeing your presentation with all these major accidents and whatever, skin burnout. So I think it was a very good sharing of knowledge.
And so we spoke about architecture, the way you build everything. Then we spoke about safety.
Yes.
Then we go to the hot topic, which is remote scanning. So because everything comes into this new thing. So in your own words, what is remote scanning? So everyone at home can understand the essence of it. Because I think there's also a lot of confusion about remote scanning. Everyone goes scanning from home. That's it.
Right.
But remote scanning been with us for many, many years in a different format, of course, but it's been there, remote access to those machines. So if you can give us a definition and where you think this is going,
right?
Because we also have, you're involved in, and you founded this project RSQS. So if you can just give us an overview of the whole topic so everyone at home can understand a little bit more.
Sure. So for decades, your OEMs, your Siemenses, your GEs, your Philipses, whatever, have been able to essentially remote into your system to observe, what you're seeing, why the system isn't working correctly, make some fixes remotely. That capability that was originally just technical in nature, from the OEMs to their customers, that's the backbone of the platform, the connectivity that is remote scanning, right? Well, now we're just enabling that technological capability that's existed for decades. And now we're making it a service, a product. So not only can, your service engineer log into your system, but now you can have anybody that you give appropriate permissions to log into your system. And that can be, so once we sort of identify that there is this platform, this connectivity model, right? And then it becomes a question of, well, what do we do with that? And we actually break it down into 4 different categories. So there's the technical remote operation, which is just sort of servicing software updates.
Troubleshooting.
Yeah. Modify a protocol at a site across town, whatever. Doesn't involve patient care. Then we can have supervision or training remote operation, right? Yeah. If I suck at doing cardiac MRI, but we have somebody across town who's really good at it, and I have a cardiac MR patient on the table, and they can essentially remote in, and they can observe what I'm doing, and they can go on the screen, and they can change the angulation or the number of slices or modify parameters, and they can see, Toby, dummy, you really need to be adjusting the angulation so that you're catching the change.
Yeah.
Right. Or I might be so hopeless at the cardiac MRI and the person across town is brilliant at it that I may just sit back and,
observe
or, update my Facebook status or whatever while that person's running the scanner.
Hopefully taking notes, hopefully, if
hopefully.
possible.
So that's the expert remote operation model, right? We still haven't changed anything in terms of who manages the patient care, at table side and who does the screenings or anything like that. So the first three models of remote operation really have no direct impacts on patient care whatsoever. They really are supplemental to the way we've always done things.
Yeah.
It's the fourth model of remote operation where people can get really excited, agitated.
Or pushback, right?
Yes, and that's the full remote operation model, right? And that's where I call in sick, right? I don't go into the facility, or I'm taking vacation or family leave, or I broke my leg, and all of a sudden we have a full work list for a magnet that we don't have a radiographer for, right? Well, maybe we have an extra radiographer at the location on the other side of town, right? And that person can essentially remote in and operate the MRI.
Yeah.
Now the question becomes, if I was the MR radiographer who was supposed to be at that location and I'm not there, who is the person who is there? And who is the individual who is essentially trained or competent enough to manage the patient care side of the activities, but doesn't necessarily really need to know anything, if they don't wish to, about how to actually
technical
drive
aspects
the
of scanning.
MRI scanner.
Yeah.
So the radiographer, the MR radiographer historically has really had two very different sets of skills, right? They can drive the MR scanner and they can manage direct patient care. If we take this sword and essentially we slice our historic MR radiographer in half, and we say, look, this half really only needs to operate the scanner, and this other half really only needs to manage patient care and the environment.
Yeah.
That's what's offered by the full remote operational model. Now, it's very easy to take a radiographer who has both halves of those, right? You have both the technical skills and the patient management skills, and say, starting tomorrow, we're only going to ask you to exercise the technical skills, right? Okay, well, I have these other skills. I'm just not putting them to use. The challenge becomes we don't have anybody else in the way we've always done things who is specifically trained in the patient management and environment skills, right? So in order for the full remote operational model to really work effectively and maintain quality and safety, one of the biggest challenges, probably the biggest challenge, is we have yet to formally define who this person is at the point of care.
We're assuming it's not a radiographer.
Well, even if it is
Or
a
an
radiographer.
MRI radiographer.
Right, yeah. So
Because if it's an MRI radiographer, already has that training. But if it
Exactly.
isn't, because of shortages of staff and everything else, that's probably what we're aiming at, to have someone that is not a full MRI radiographer.
Right. And even if, let's say, they're just an X-ray radiographer, right? An X-ray radiographer doesn't, in my experience, doesn't necessarily really have effective training for how to work in the MRI environment, right? They don't know what coils are. They will know basic patient handling. They'll know, infection control and infection prevention protocols. They'll know, personal health information, data privacy, that sort of stuff.
But they won't know 5 gauss line or
Exactly.
things like that.
So even if we say we're going to take a non-MR radiographer and we're going to put them in this point of care role, even if we start with that individual, we're going to have to increase their knowledge and their skills in, relative to the MRI area. In my opinion, while there are absolutely some advantages for taking radiographers from other modalities, because they will have some, basic skills.
Background knowledge as well.
Whoever they are, whether we bring them from X-ray or CT or mammo or ultrasound, we're essentially going to have to train them in a whole new set of skills for that. So if we have to build a skills development and training program, couldn't we also train them on, basic anatomy and patient handling and information security kinds of things as well? So We just need to build sort of the curriculum, the knowledge base, define what that is. And then once we have essentially created what I believe amounts to a new role, a new position, then we really need to describe the workflow, right? When a patient comes in and completes screening, right? Is it this new role that essentially does the full review of the screening form? Does this new role, this new individual, essentially, are they a postman who takes the information from the patient and gives it to the remote technologist who does the review, but that remote technologist may or may not really have the capability to talk to the patient directly? So we need to define probably multiple different compliance pathways of how can we achieve equal or greater results than as compared to the way we've always done things, with new people, with a new workflow. And that's a big ask. That's fairly daunting to kind of take on that many new things all at once.
I think this is exactly why at the moment it seems there are more questions than answers. Is that people tend to think, okay, remote scanning seems a big thing, but what about safety? And this is the thing that mostly I would say I heard from people saying, yes, remote scanning, okay, but what are we going to do about the safety of the patient?
Is this where RSQS kind of has a role or is trying to play a role as well, I believe?
Yeah. So RSQS, Remote Scanning Quality and Safety, rsqs.org, is an organization that is really taking it upon themselves to begin to define this new role, right? That we've never really had before, and what skills and knowledge and competency are sort of minimally required for this new role, as well defining. Here are different compliance pathways. The screening form example that I gave is just one of probably hundreds of different aspects of care in the MRI environment that really need to be mapped out, and likely will have 1, 2, 3, 7 different ways that you could actually execute this. And as long as every party involved in the care of that patient, which means the enterprise, the hospital, right? It means the radiologist, it means the remote radiographer, it means the point of care individual. If we have other people coming associated with the care of that patient, maybe somebody programming a device, maybe it's a patient who requires clinical monitoring and we have nursing, coming with them. Maybe it's somebody who requires special medical care coincident with their MR, so anesthesia, sedation, right? So we essentially need to identify, who are all of the people who may be involved in MRI care, and how do we define the roles and responsibilities and communication pathways between and among all of these different individuals and organizations so that the process is mapped out.
Yes.
One of the challenges, I think, one of the reasons that I believe some people find the notion of remote MRI so intimidating or off-putting is MRI has never in its history had to think about its workflow, right? We essentially looked at when MRI was brand new, we looked at what CT was doing. We said, okay, we'll do that, right? Oh, this
despite being almost totally different.
Yeah. Well, then we said, we need to change patients. We need to do the screening forms. We need to do this. So organically, we've just sort of incrementally adapted the MRI workflow. We've never really had to think about, well, what if we took the whole thing apart and we had to reassemble it? Would we reassemble it in the same way?
This is a very interesting perspective.
Yeah, and that's basically what we're trying to do.
That's what remote scanning.
It is nice for me as an
asks.
external person to know there is actually someone working on these things, because you just hear that this is coming, but you don't actually know how all those questions that you mentioned will be answered. So
and I think to date, the folks who have offered answers to the questions have offered little tiny slices of answers. So I talked about how wonderful the 2024 ACR manual is. the one thing that I might pull back on my unreserved praise is the way that they describe remote scanning, because they only talk about the staffing piece.
Yeah.
And they also, there's a virtual asterisk and then sort of a disclaimer that says, we're only describing staffing in the context of the roles and responsibilities that have historically existed. They didn't see this as an opportunity to define the new role, right? And so when you constrain yourself with the roles as they've always existed, it's a square peg in a round hole, right? It's not the most effective or efficient solution to the problem you're presented with today. And so I feel RSQS believes that what we really need to do is take this opportunity to disassemble the entire MRI workflow and build
Start
a new
from
model.
scratch, basically.
Exactly, right.
Toby, this was amazing. We only have one question, and you mentioned that MRI is magic to you.
I exactly wanted to say the same thing.
Yeah.
Why did you say that MRI is
Absolutely, because we always have the question, why MRI, for all our guests, and you already told us that MRI is magic. So why is it magic to you? We have like 30, 60 seconds.
No pressure. Perpetual motion machines aren't supposed to exist. MRI is a perpetual motion machine, preserving electrical current. We take pictures with magnetism. We, essentially listen to the screams of emitted RF, spectrographic RF signals coming from individual atoms and molecules in the body, and we can reconstruct this into individual slices or three-dimensional models. It seems like science fiction. It seems so unlikely, impossible. The fact that so many of us get to work in and around these amazing machines and spend literal lifetimes sort of delving into how and why these pieces of equipment work and how and why they're so amazing in terms of being able to generate images and diagnose disease that we can't otherwise, or not as effectively or not as early. It tickles all kinds of nerdy parts of my brain, that I get to. I'm not a physicist, but I enjoy very much learning about the physics of MRI. I'm not a clinician, but I very much enjoy learning about sort of the clinical applications of this.
You kind of have to, right? In terms of safety, you kind of have to know a little bit about all of it. Otherwise,
and it's fantastic because even if you are not part of this categories you mentioned, the feeling that I get is that you're so deeply involved and passionate. You're talking as a physicist to me or a radiographer. So it's like you can.
And I saw a bit of emotion there.
It's rare that you find something that is both so engaging and attractive to you, and then also something that I could live 20 lifetimes, and I think, spend 20 lifetimes trying to understand the relationships between, the medicine and the technical operation and the management and the physics and the equipment design. There is so much wealth of information sort of within this one field that if you are so inclined, you could spend multiple lifetimes sort of sussing out all of those relationships and better understanding each of the components.
The trick is to become a vampire and study MRI forever. Toby, thank you very much. Before we go, I just want you to leave us a tiny note on our Everything MRI book, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, I would love to.
I think we're running out of pages, actually.
Not yet. And thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure.
That was my pleasure.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you both.